ask you if you have any questions, let me make a few announcements. I had sent out an email to all of you indicating that there are 3 films that have been put on the syllabus, and they're available through that video furnace link, which you get at the end of the web page. This is one of those 3 films. We're not going to watch the entire film. We're just going to watch a small segment and do some work of interpretation here. But you are expected to watch all 3 of those films. Okay, you should consider that part of the syllabus. And in connection with that, also let me say that there is a slight change in the plans for the remaining 2 weeks of this class. I mean, originally you were not going to have any lectures at all in the last week. Because I was actually not going to be here. I was going to be out of the country. But I've had to cancel my trip for various reasons. And so we will, in fact, actually have lectures next week as well. But there will be visual material both this week and next week. And in part what we'll be doing is we'll be looking at some films, the films that have actually been placed on reserve for you. And we're going to be looking only at very small segments of these films and then doing, as I said, some work of interpretation. All right, so that's the substantive change. It doesn't really affect you in the sense that you are still expected to come, as the syllabus makes it very clear, next week and watch the films in class. But instead of that, you will be having part of the class time devoted to a lecture. And because of that change, it's possible, I cannot guarantee it, it's possible that there may be about half an hour or 45 minutes of time next week, which could be devoted simply to questions and answers and to a review of the material. So I would suggest that you look at your class notes, do the reading, and come prepared to ask questions next week, because you may have a chance to do that, for, as I said, a sustained period of time. Okay. I did send out an email as well about this event related to Bhopal, but I will make an announcement about that on Thursday. Because that event is on Thursday, and I just wanted to remind you once again to if you can, to block out that time if you're able to come. All right. Now, does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask related to either the previous, lecture, which was really in part a screening of Diwar? I will continue on the subject of cinema for a short period of time today, and then move on to some other aspects of what I've been describing as the popular and public culture in India. But if there are any questions, this is the time to ask them. Yes.
This is kind of related, but do you do like office hours at a different time instead of Thursday office hours?
Any different time? Well, I don't really have plans to do that, but it's possible that next Wednesday that I may be around to hold office hours. Yeah, in addition to the times that are available on Monday, on Tuesday and Thursday. Yeah, but if you can't make it on a Thursday, I think Thursday afternoon is when I have office hours. If you can't make it on a Thursday afternoon, not this Thursday morning, but the following week, I will be available on Thursday morning as well. Yeah, okay. And until such time as the exam is handed out to you, which is going to be Thursday of next week in class, until such time you obviously can come and see me and talk to me about anything related to the course. Once the exam has been handed out to you, I'm not going to be able to take any questions related to the course, except for very technical questions if there happen to be any. Nishita, yeah. On Bhopal? Yeah, it's mentioned in the email. Yeah, it's mentioned in the email, yeah. When I make the announcement on Thursday, I will let you know again. I don't have the flyer in front of me, so I don't remember the room number. Yeah, yeah. Any further questions of any kind? Yes?
Geology 4645.
Okay, geology 4345?
Oh, 4645.
4645, right? Okay. All right, let me tell you what I'm going to do today. As I said, I want to talk just a little bit more about cinema, and then I really want to move on to the question of public and popular culture in the wider sense. And one of the things I want to look at is what we might describe as street culture. You have an article on the syllabus which really talks about that briefly, but we want to be able to try to extrapolate from that to see what it really means to talk about a street culture, and why is it that street culture of the sort that we can speak about in India is something that is, I think, quite distinct from anything that would pass for street culture in countries such as the United States today. I'm not sure that there really is any street culture left in the US any longer, but if there is, it's certainly confined to very, very small pockets of, I would say, a few cities at best, right? So, we'll want to see what exactly it means to talk about something like street culture. And one of the things that I also want to do is I want to look at the space created by trains and by railway stations. So the two films that you're going to be seeing small segments of will give you a window into that as well, although these films give a window into many other things as well. Let me recapitulate very briefly what I had spoken to you about on Thursday of the previous week, right, when we had finished seeing segments from Diwar. So remember that this film was made in 1975 with Amitabh Bachchan and Shashi Kapoor, and Amitabh Bachchan is still very much around. In fact, if you have seen Slumdog Millionaire, if you haven't, I strongly recommend that you go see the film. You would notice that the figure of Amitabh appears not literally in the film, but he's all over the film. In fact, I mean, I've long thought about writing, since I saw the film in January, I've thought about writing a long article on Slumdog, because lots of crucial moments in this film have what I would call a Amitabh moment. And if you've seen films such as Zanjeer, Sholay, Muqaddar Ka Sikandar, Diwar, all of these Amitabh films, there is a moment from each of these films which is actually encapsulated in Slumdog. And of course, if you think about it, I mean, even peripherally, okay, even if you think about it at the surface level, and you think about Slumdog as in part a story about two brothers who have gone their different ways, you can obviously see where a film like Diwar is already coming into the film in numerous ways. And don't forget that one of the classic scenes of Slumdog where the boy jumps into a pile of shit. Literally, I'm not being metaphorical here. If you've seen the film, you would know that. I mean, this all happens because Amitabh has come into the little town or village, right? Well, into the slum, really, frankly, not a little town or village, into the slum. And he's come there, and this boy is a real devotee, and he wants to get an autograph of Amitabh Bachchan, right? Right. So, how Amitabh actually fits into this film is quite an interesting thing. And for those of you who don't know Indian television, and I wouldn't advise you to spend too much time knowing Indian television, but the only thing that you do need to know there, which is important for Slumdog Millionaire, is that the show in Slumdog Millionaire, who will become a millionaire, Kaun Banega Crorepati, was actually originally hosted in India by Amitabh Bachchan himself. So even the show, which is mimicked here in Slumdog, was hosted by Amitabh. Right, so he's in a sense all over the film, if you really think about it, and it's an interesting, it seems to me, commentary, Slumdog, not just on slums and on the nature of life in India today, but it's in fact, in some ways, a meta commentary on Amitabh Bachchan and his whole career, right? And I'm certainly quite persuaded by the idea that Danny Boyle, the filmmaker, actually had done a fair bit of research into the popular Indian cinema. All right. So let me add a few things to this by way of recapitulation. Namely that if you look at Diwar, there are a number of different things that stand out. We can't spell out all of them, but I've mentioned them before, and now it's important to mention them again because some of them will resurface in the documentaries that you're going to be seeing. Right? And those have to do with such things as the shift from the rural area, from the hinterland, the countryside, to the urban metropolis, right? To the extent that the urban metropolis is now occupying the space of imagination of people to a very great degree, right? So that's, I think, number one. Number two, the place of railways. And again, you have to read that in part metaphorically, not entirely, because the railways are the largest employer in India, by the way, the largest employer in India. In fact, the railway budget has the unique distinction in India of being not a part of the national budget. So when the national budget is presented in Parliament, the railway budget is not a part of that. The railway budget is presented separately. And the railway minister is always held in that sense a rather important position in the Indian cabinet, right? The railways, of course, represent many things. I mean, they represent not only the fact that they're the largest employer, but they represent that shift from the countryside to the urban area, because how is it that many of these people have gravitated towards the urban areas, towards the metros? But it also represents the idea of mobility. And you do have to read mobility both literally and metaphorically, because it is the shift of people, it is a movement of people. I mean, one part of the history of the modern world is the enormous shifts of migration, right, that are taking place all over the world. Right? And there are different categories of these kinds of people, but some of them certainly are represented in a film such as Diwar. Right? So the idea of mobility, and mobility here also means, by the way, caste mobility, class mobility, right, where the trains are simply working in some ways as a metaphor for those other kinds of mobility, in the sense in which you saw in The White Tiger, right? Because certainly Balram represents, if I may put it this way, a kind of mobility, right? Okay, so the idea of mobility, the shift from the countryside to the urban areas, the space of the city in the imagination of the nation, right? All of these are crucial features of this film, right? And of course, the other crucial features have to do with the nature of family, the nature of community, the nature of self, because one of the things I had argued for you, and I would be prepared to make that argument at very great length, but you've already seen a segment of that argument in that article which I'd written, which is included in the book that you've read of Cricket, Guinness, and Gandhi, and that's on the impossibility of the other, right? That if you look at Hindi films, one of the interesting things about these films is how, in some sense, eventually everybody is incorporated into the human family or the human community, right? Now, there are some interesting questions that arise if you look at Indian cinema. One of those questions has to do with how has a Hindi film changed? And here again, I've already made a number of suggestions to you, but I want to recapitulate them once again for you, particularly one of the arguments here, because when we move into the last segment next week, that argument will be quite important, and that is the fact that the Hindi film has become much more sensitive to the idea of the other. The other is usually the terrorist now in the Hindi film. This is a figure that has appeared in the Hindi film, I would say fundamentally only in the last 10 or 15 years. You never really saw somebody like, you know, an other in that sense. That is somebody who cannot be eventually incorporated, right, into the family or the community, and therefore that means that that person must be eliminated, which means that there is some kind of distinction between self and the other, which is becoming much more important in the Hindi cinema today than it had been before. The other thing I pointed out, and here again I will touch on it in my concluding remarks in week 10, is the relationship of the Hindi film to constituencies outside the country, right, to the diaspora, for example, right? Increasing number of Hindi films not simply being made in the diaspora, right? They may or may not be made in the diaspora. They may be made in India, or they may be set strictly in India, although a good number of them now will have a portion of the film set in New York or London or something like that. But what I'm really pointing to here is, how does a film itself actually change when it becomes sensitive to the presence of a diasporic kind of community, right? Has the nature of romantic love, for example, changed, you know, in the Hindi film? I mean, it used to be said of Indian marriages, and it is still said of them, and it's probably true of 95% of them, but that when you marry a person, you don't marry one person, you marry a whole family, right? Well, but it seems to me that if you look at the modern Hindi film, you know, for example, a film such as Alvida Na Kehna, right, which is Don't Say Goodbye, well, it's very clear that you know, that the nature of romantic love in some sense has changed, because the idea of the individual incorporating some notion of subjectivity, being an individual subject, exercising individual agency, has become much more important in romantic love than it used to be, let's say, 2 decades ago, and certainly 3 or 4 decades ago, right? So these are, it seems to me, that some of the kinds of things that have really changed in the Hindi film. And as I said, there are other kinds of interesting questions that one might want to ask, such as, what is the relationship of the Hindi film to predominantly English-speaking audiences, right? And English-speaking audiences is really perhaps not the right phrase, because people in India who speak only English are a really, really small minority, right? I mean, a really small minority. Most speakers of English would be bilingual because they would have grown up with some Indian language as well, even though they might not speak it most of the time. So one can actually broaden that question to say, well, what is the relationship of the Hindi femme to a kind of a elite, to a Western educated kind of elite, okay, in India? Do they see the Hindi femme the same way that other Indian audiences do, right? What is the relationship of Hindi femme to the masses, on the other hand, right? I mean, is this a femme that is made concretely for the masses? Because if you're looking obviously at some argument of realism, right, if you see the Hindi femme with its flamboyant palaces and all of that, well, obviously it has no relationship to what you would describe as the masses as a whole. And some people have argued that there is, if I may put it this way, a very strong fantasy element, you know, in the Hindi film. I'm not entirely persuaded by that argument, because one of the things that I think the Hindi femme is quite sensitive to is, if I may put it this way, the social norms and social mores of that society. So its representations of Hindu rituals, for example, okay, its understanding of caste, which is almost never mentioned. And one of the reasons it's never mentioned is because in middle class conversations, the subject of caste very seldom actually comes about, right? So when people like myself are growing up in India, in fact, we had no idea what caste we belonged to. I mean, caste is something you learn through the books, and then of course when you get married, or when you're about to be married, then it becomes all important, because there are going to be restrictions on who you can or cannot marry unless you decide to flout all the conventions, right? So I'm saying that this idea that, well, yes, if you have, you know, a poor boy, rich girl kind of syndrome in the Hindi femme, and somebody says, well, that's really fantasy, it may be, and it may be for the same reason that T.S. Eliot had described why it is that we need fantasy, because he has his very famous lines in a poem called Burnt Norton, where he says, humankind cannot bear too much reality, right? Now, it may be that it's for that reason that you do have some element of fantasy in these films as well. But nonetheless, I think that the films are not entirely fantasy, that there is some particular relationship that they have to social reality. And I think that that's one reason why these films, in some ways, have been able to sustain the population, you know, not simply as a means of entertainment, but as a means of understanding the nature of Indian society. All right, now let's, for a moment, move the discussion from films to some larger considerations, okay? And those larger considerations have to do with what is the nature of popular culture and public culture, okay, in India, right? And I made some observations about that. You remember that we had started out before the lecture on cinema and before you actually saw the excerpts from Devar, I had made some distinctions between the classical, the folk, the mass, and the popular, right? And we had spent some time on discussing what is the relationship between these four elements to each other, right, in the constitution of what comes to be known as culture. But there is a relationship, obviously, by the way, of cinema to street culture as well. One of the ways in which you can see that relationship is that if you go out into Indian metropolitan areas, you see these huge billboards, okay, which are not advertisements. I mean, you see them for advertisements as well. Certainly you see them for advertisements, but for films, very large ones. And I have to tell you, by the way, that until about 15 years ago, all of these were hand-painted. Okay, these were not actually produced by machines. And, you know, I'm talking about some billboards which the size of which would be the length of this room from here to that end of the wall, okay? So these are all hand-painted, and there's a whole class of people who used to do that, and they would work in studios and then come during the middle of the night and put it up. And so when you woke up next morning, a new film has come out, well, there's this huge billboard advertising you know, this film, right? Movie stars obviously have a huge place in Indian culture. Amitabh Bachchan himself, by the way, entered into politics in India. Now, that's not entirely unusual. We know an American president who was in movies before, made a mess of the movies and made a mess of the politics as well, Ronald Reagan. But there are people who have entered into both domains, right? Okay, and so similarly, you have somebody like Amitabh, who was, by the way, as a politician, singularly unsuccessful if I may put it this way. And in fact, I think realized quite quickly that he would have to withdraw from the political life. Right? But there have been lots of people like him who have moved into the political domain. A very famous example is an actor from Andhra Pradesh, N.T. Rama Rao, who basically was an actor, and sometimes it was hard to distinguish the actor from the person in real life. So he would play gods. Sometimes he would play the politician, right? And you get this, of course, in real life as well, because he was a person who commanded, if I may put it this way, not simply huge audiences, but commanded the veneration of a large number of people, much as a god might command the veneration of a large number of people, right? So there are these kinds of connections too. Politicians moving into film stars moving into the domain of politics. If one had to do a kind of a history of the Indian cinema, you could also look at other kinds of political connections that the Indian cinema has. For example, the Bombay film industry has a very substantial relationship with the underworld. Okay, and I'm going to recommend a book here that you might want to look at. It's called Maximum City. That's the exact title of the book. The author's name is Suketu Mehta. This is a book that came out about 4 years ago. It's a large, lavish, very elegantly written history of Bombay, of Mumbai. And there are large chunks of that book which are devoted to a discussion of the relationship between Bombay cinema and the underworld. I mean, where does Bombay cinema get its funding from? What are the procedures of extortion that are used? How do you control the studio system? Right? So all of these are interesting aspects. Right? And I'm simply laying them out for you so that you get a sense of what are some of the complexities that are involved in appreciating the role of Indian cinema and its relationship to Indian politics and society. But having mentioned these billboards, let me use that as an opportunity to move into the question of street culture. Okay. Now there's an article that you've read, which is by Arjuna Pudrai, a very short article. And one of the things he says about the Indian city and about streets in India is that the street is the place where you find all kinds of people doing all kinds of things. So yes, you find the vendors, you find the sabzi wala. Sabzi wala is somebody who sells vegetables. You find a panwala. You're going to see a little excerpt, by the way, in one of the films here. You'll see the panwala as well. So somebody who runs that shop, little corner shop that I mentioned to you on a number of different occasions, right, where you sell pan, which is a leaf, and you can make it into a sweet pan, or you can make it into a tobacco pan by putting tobacco in it, right? The panwala also carries tobacco, cigarettes, and so on. You have the kabadi wala. Kabadi wala is a person. Wala, by the way, is the common ending to all of these. Sabzi wala, pan wala, kabadi wala. Wala is a suffix, which means the person who does, whatever that thing is, right? Kabadi wala is a person who goes around from street to street shouting kabadi wala, which means he's the guy who picks up garbage would not be the right word, material that you recycle. Such as newspapers or small electronic goods that you've thrown away, or empty beer bottles, right, and so forth and so on. Right? And so Arjuna Pudrai is describing this. So this is part of what is really street culture. There's a guy who goes around and he sharpens knives on a bicycle, right? So if you want to get your knives sharpened, that's what he's going to do. There's also a guy who sits there in some street corners, and he's someone who cleans your ears. I would not recommend that, of course, but this is what his profession is, right? Okay. Then you have the washerman, the dhobi wala, the dhobi, right? And of course you have in profusion people preparing all kinds of foods, right, and selling them, right? So now the question is going to be, all right, so you get a ethnography, you get a description of what is happening on a street, okay, in most parts of India. Maybe not, obviously, the street where the Prime Minister of India lives, or the President lives, or the Railway Minister lives, or streets in the diplomatic enclave, but in most neighborhoods you will find streets of this kind, right? So my question to you would be, supposing I gave you a question on the exam and I said, okay, this is what Arjuna Podrai describes. What do you make of it? What is he trying to say there? Because if he was simply saying that, well, hey, Indian streets are lively places because you'll find, as my daughter, when she was 4 years old, when she first saw this in a big way, she said, my God, we have a moving zoo in India, right, on the street, right? You've got, monkeys, you've got a donkey, you've got camels, you've got elephants. If you're lucky, you'll get camels and elephants too. Of course, dogs, cats, pigs, right? All moving around. Cows, an ample number. Speed breakers, as they are on Indian streets, right? Okay, so you've got all of these animals moving around. So my question to you is, what do you make of it? Right? Yeah, it's lively, it's colorful. Anything else that comes to mind? Anything. How would you interpret it? Yeah.
It could be a harmony between the nature and humans.
Okay, good beginning. A harmony, some kind of harmonious relationship between humans and animals. In principle, I think you're right. Although if you see how the cats and dogs are treated, I think you would immediately change your mind. Why? Because cats, the most common thing, especially if you little children, is you see a stone and you just throw it at the cat. Yeah. Okay. And dogs, by the way, people generally tend to keep away from dogs because these are stray dogs, and you don't want to get rabies or anything if you get bit by a dog, right? So, in principle, you're right. And I wouldn't reject that interpretation at all, but I think that one would have to be able to make some distinctions for the reasons that I've just given you, right? Okay, yeah, so over there first, yeah? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Trash is a difficult one because, frankly, trash is a big problem in India, huge problem. I mean, it is a fundamental problem, the disposal of garbage, and that, I think, has to do with many issues. It has to do in part with the caste system. It has to do with the fact that there is a taboo, if I may put it this way, okay, on having on having any kind of interaction with things that are filthy, okay. But for example, the water issue that you mentioned there, well, that would be true if you could argue, which it would be difficult to argue, that in the Indian cities they have developed good methods for rainwater harvesting, which they need to do, by the way, right? Because the runoff, India is a country which has a monsoon, right? And in the south you get 2 monsoons, in the north you get, in most places in the north you get 1 monsoon. Now when you get a monsoon, which means you've got, somewhere between 2 to 3 months of pretty heavy rainfall, right? And not all of that water, by the way, is completely lost, because if it seeps into the ground, it's actually not bad because it can replenish the water table. One of the things that's happened in India, okay, I mean, this is very much a part of the history of India, contemporary India, right? So this is not something incidental, right? Is the fact that you have acute water shortages, right? My own prediction, by the way, is that in the 21st century all over the world, the biggest wars are going to be fought not over oil, they're going to be fought over water. Easily, whether it's the Middle East or whether it's India and Pakistan or whether it's parts of Africa, water is going to be the principal issue of the 21st century. Now, what you have in many parts of India is that, yeah, you've got this water that seeps into the ground, and you could say it's lost. Well, it depends on where that water is seeping into the ground, because if it's seeping into the ground in rural areas, well, it's not a bad idea at all, because what it's doing is it's helping to replenish, okay, the groundwater, and basically it's going to lift up the water table, okay. But in the cities, certainly, virtually all of that water is lost. Virtually all of it is lost, okay. So you don't really have a system of rainwater harvesting, and I think if you wanted to argue that, well, Indians have a different relationship to the elements, okay, one could make that argument, but that argument would really have nothing to do with, the question which had to do with street culture, right? What is a particular, how does one explain, okay, this scenario that Arjuna Podra is laying out in his article? And I'm saying to you, okay, it sounds like it's a lively place to be. You can have your ear cleaned, you can, have your knives sharpened, right? You can do all kinds of things on the Indian street. You can move from one kind of street food to another, from papri chaat to samosas to dosas, right? To Chinese, fast food, all in one, small corner of the street. You could do that very easily, right? But the question is, what is one going to really make of that? Yeah.
This shows the lack of stability or lack of government intervention.
Lack of stability. Why would it be lack of stability?
I mean, it's just everyone's in chaos. There's no.
It's not chaos for them. There's no chaos at all. It only looks like chaos to maybe an outsider. Everybody there knows, by the way, what they're doing. I think what you're saying is that maybe there isn't enough government regulation, but I think that the minute you start having too much government regulation, you basically eliminate something called street culture. Why don't you have street culture in the United States? You don't, right? Nishita.
Bear with me on this. It seems
Yeah.
to me that each street, right, forms its own community. Therefore, it's like this mini India that encompasses the way that India actually works. So each person has this position. Each person provides a service. Then within that set of that street, that community, because everyone knows each other, it's like this. Its own form of government, its own form of ethics.
Yeah.
And each street works that way on the larger grand scale of the way India itself works. So each
Okay.
street is like that. So if you moved, let's say, to another street,
Yeah.
you're moving into another realm of the way that street runs, that street works, the way that functions.
Okay. I think I understand what you're saying, and I think in part I would accept what you're saying. Maybe I might use a slightly different language. I think that what you're trying to say is that perhaps every street, okay, the life in every street is, if I may put it this way, an organic whole. Okay? It is in some ways self-sustained, in some ways, right? And so therefore, what appears to be chaos or disorder to an outsider, in fact, is nothing like that at all, because there is a kind of a harmony between the elements in that street. People know what their place is in that, okay, in that lifestyle, if I may put it this way, right? But of course, you have fights as well. I mean, one of the things you have to remember, by the way, is the intervention of the state comes here, by the way, in a huge way. Where does the state come in? Much of this activity that goes on in the street is unregulated, right? Unregulated, particularly the vendors, is unregulated. So what you have the cops coming in every 2 or 3 months raiding the place, and usually if they're not going to raid the place, that means they're going to extort money, right? So, it's not as though the state is not there, which is why maybe the metaphor of the organic community is not entirely correct either. But I think that what you're saying would be true, except that I think there's probably a bit of a stretch involved in making the argument, to that degree. I think to maybe a slightly smaller degree, one might be able to go with that argument, Yeah.
Transportation function of the street is overridden by the functions of exchange, whether it's information exchange
Yeah.
or financial exchange. So instead of a one-way flow
Yeah.
facilitated for a specific purpose, there's a multiplicity of flows of different kinds that allow people to find their own space in the street rather than occupy the street as part of a larger system.
I like that. Good. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say that what you have is you have a multiplicity of, as you're saying, flows. Okay, so it's not simply, well, a street is intended to convey people from point A to point B, right? I mean, that would be the transportation flow there, which may or may not get altered by other kinds of flows, including flows of commodities, right? Because obviously you're talking about flows of commodities, you're talking about flows of people, right, involved in different kinds of social transactions, right? Yeah, so I think I would agree with that. I would agree with that. Can one make further extrapolations? Yes.
Well, if I saw a street like that, I would think of like entrepreneurship in India and the ambitious nature of India as a whole and its individuals.
Okay, well, I would say again, I agree with that, but it's perhaps a little bit too much charitable to the entrepreneurial spirit, because I mean, you know, this is what you have to do to survive, right? It's what you do to survive. And, you know, if you're selling chole bhature is an Indian snack, you know, and you're selling it at 20 rupees per plate, and you're making 1 rupees. Well, you know, per plate that you're selling, and your earnings for the day are 50 rupees. You know, whether one would want to call it entrepreneurial or simply a survival instinct is, I think, an open question, if you see what I mean, right? That one could actually say that, yes, you're right, that this does exemplify the entrepreneurial spirit, but it's also the instinct to survive, which is prevalent in virtually every human being and every living thing, you know, right? Nikhil, you had your hand up a while ago. Lost your train of thought. Okay, Anjana.
I have interpreted the street as kind of being an example of the desegregation of space in India.
Yeah.
Where how even like having discussions about the differences between the rural sector and then the urban sector, and how different areas around the world are distinct in like different levels of development. It's kind of like you have a whole like diverse group of people in this one street.
Yeah.
For like more than one purpose, whether it be like you said, shining shoes or cleaning, you know, your
Yeah.
selling food.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it kind of speaks to the diversity that we have.
That's true. I mean, I think a street culture will almost always do that, although there are homogeneous street cultures in some parts of the world too, where you don't simply have a mix of populations of that particular kind. But I think that if you're saying that, look, the street is more likely to be a place that will be a meeting point, a crossroads for different cultures, different worldviews, I think you're absolutely right. Unquestionably so. Right? Aruna?
The job delineation that you see on the streets kind of goes back to the issue of who has access to certain things and who, because some people might not be able to afford certain things, who has to do certain tasks for survival.
Yeah.
And then it kind of seems to mirror the example of the caste system that you gave, where some people argue that different parts kind of function together to provide a society with all the things that it needs.
Yes.
And so maybe like if Brahmins are the priests or scholarly, and then the Kshatriyas provide, they're like the warriors. And so in this way, somebody's providing the food and somebody's doing the cleaning service. Somebody is, and so it's just all different services that need to be together in order to have a person kind of.
That's true. I mean, that would be something like what I think Anjana had mentioned, that what you get is you get a kind of a, you get a, a society in microcosm, okay? Right? So rather than, let's say, looking at the macro level, you basically look at the street and you say that the street itself, in fact, in some ways, is a microcosm of India, right? You find the various kinds of diversities of occupations, professions, cultural, ethnic backgrounds, so forth and so on. I think to some degree that would be true. Although I must say that the kinds of things that interest me most about street culture, for the most part, have not really been mentioned in the discussion that we've had up till this point in time. And I'm going to suggest 2 things to you, which I think are quite critical for an examination of what might be called street culture. The first is the absolute lack of a distinction in Indian culture between the inside and the outside. I mean, most middle-class Indians will not stand up in my place here and say the kinds of things that I'm going to tell you right now, which is that, there are highly private activities that you do in public in India, and you do it by and large without any sense of embarrassment. I would not include sex in that, by the way, okay? All right, just in case you think that I'm, going to be moving in that direction. No, but I am talking about bodily functions. And, I was watching a couple of nights ago a Hindi film, which is a relatively recent film, with Amitabh Bachchan in it, by the way, a very recent film, Chini Kam it's called, right? And it begins with this scene where this guy is gargling, okay, and clearing out his nose. Now, when you do that in India, a person who is 100 meters away can listen to you. I'm serious, okay, in many Indian cities, okay? And so on the street, what do you have? You see things that you would consider to be highly private functions, which include, for the most part, the cooking of food, cleaning yourself, okay, right? Washing yourself, putting soap, putting a bucket of water on yourself. You don't do this out in the public. You do that in public if you have to. And you could say it's force of necessity. It's force of necessity. So you've got, you know, a street here and there's one hand pump, right? So I don't know if you know what a hand pump is. It's, you know, one of those pumps where you draw out water, right? And you've got one hand pump and it's a street and there are, you know, 500 people, 1,000 people, 2,000 people either living there or eating there or doing something or the other, right? And there's this one single source of water, and that's where you get your drinking water, and that's where you go and wash your clothes, and that's where you go and take a bath, right? And you do that. So this is what I'm suggesting to you, that one of the things that is quite interesting is the lack of a distinction between the inside and the outside. On the other hand, and this is where an immense paradox comes in, and we would have to spend a lot of time trying to unravel this. Nowhere is this distinction enforced so strictly as in India. On the other hand, I'm saying to you, right? And what illustration would I give? The illustration I would give would be you go to a relatively poor neighborhood, okay, and you go to the interior of a small home inside that neighborhood on a particular street, spotlessly clean. And the same people will throw their garbage out right outside their home on the street, right? So somewhere there the line begins as to what is your conception of your space and what is a space that you are not responsible for at all, right? And I've seen this in countless number of places in India, countless number of homes that I can think of. I mean, it's a very common observation. Once you actually bring it to someone's attention, it immediately registers, right? So you're walking down a street, for example, in the middle class neighborhood where I grew up, where, as I said, if you go inside the homes, most of them are immaculately clean, spotlessly clean, right? And yet outside each home there's going to be piles of trash, and none of the people living in that home will be disturbed by that. Not only will they not be disturbed by it, they'll contribute to it. So when they eat their banana, you know, okay, the first thing they'll do is they'll just fling this banana peel, right? Right? So this distinction is being observed between the inside and the outside. And yet if you look at a street itself of the kind that Arjuna Podra is talking about in his article Street Culture, what we are saying is that the notion of the inside and the outside does not in fact actually work, right? So there is this sense of paradox that is at the heart of what I'm describing as a kind of a public culture that you find in India. And the other way that I would use it, so remember I said that I would make two distinctions, and the second distinction I would make, which is obviously related to the inside and the outside, is a distinction between the public and the private, which I'm suggesting to you is not at all important in the Indian context for the most part, right? Which is why you can perform certain bodily functions, and you can do that out in the public domain, right? You can do that in the public domain, which is something that you wouldn't do, let's say, in a culture such as the US or UK, because here, if I may put it this way, a certain conception of what is the private life of an individual starts to become exceedingly important in the 19th century. It was not important, by the way, in the West either, for the most part, right? But by the early part of the 19th century, late part of the 18th century, the distinction between public and private starts to become important in the West. And therefore, what the West did was it regimented certain spheres of life and said, well, these really belong to the private sphere, and then there are other things that belong to the public sphere. So sexuality, for example, is something that was pushed into something called the private sphere, okay, right? And I'm suggesting to you that, in fact, actually, what is interesting about street culture in India is the fact that it is a defiance, to some degree, of the distinction between the public and the private, okay? Right? And, you know, this is something that you would have to extrapolate. So I think that when you read Arjuna Podrai's article, you cannot read it simply as an ethnography, right? As an anthropological description, which is what he is. He's an anthropologist, cultural anthropologist of, oh, yeah, this is what the Indian street looks like. You know, there's a kabadi wala, there's a sabzi wala, there's a pan wala, you know, there's this guy, there's that guy, right? And they're all somehow jostling around, and they're jostling around with the animals. So now we go back to the question of animals, right? Because I think it was suggested here that, well, you know, the fact that you find all of these animals suggests that there is a certain kind of harmony between humans and animals, which perhaps doesn't really exist okay, in that culture. I don't know if I would call it harmony. I would say that there is a continuum between animals and humans, which I think for the most part has been lost over here. Okay, a continuum. Now, I think you see that continuum in here, okay, in the keeping of pets to a certain degree, but the keeping of pets in the West, again, has a very specific social history, because you don't find really the keeping of pets in the West very common until basically 200 years ago. I mean, if you read social histories of pets, for example, okay, and there are historians who have worked on this kind of question, you find that the notion of keeping pets only becomes common in the West about 200 years ago, and that is when the idea of the individual family begins to emerge. Right? So the keeping of pets may have a certain relationship to the loneliness of life here as well. I mean, you could make an explicit argument of that kind, right? Because keeping pets in India has not at all been common. Now, you're beginning to find that happening. You're beginning to find that happening in the rich neighborhoods where you'll see people walking their Dobermans, or usually poodles, by the way, right? You know, some kind of sign of conspicuous consumption and wealth, if I may put it this way, right? Okay, but this has not really been the norm in that society, right? So, in other words, you don't bracket animals off. You don't either make them into pets or put them in a zoo, which is the two things that you do here. There's another thing you do. You eat them, maybe, right? Which is done in many cultures. You eat animals, right? But basically, I'm suggesting to you that what we do in a culture with animals is quite interesting, because essentially keeping pets or putting them in a zoo is bracketing them off, right? Now, they have not been bracketed off that way in India. But on the other hand, I think it would be a mistake to have some kind of romantic conception and say that, well, animals and humans actually exist in a very harmonious relationship with each other. I mean, Mahatma Gandhi used to say that nowhere in India, I mean, nowhere in the world are cows as badly treated as they are in India. And I think he's absolutely right about that, right? So the cow is a venerated animal, right? I mean, if you're a Hindu, you do not eat beef. There's an absolute prohibition on the consumption of beef, right? But on the other hand, you squeeze the cow for the last drop of milk, right? Keep on doing that until the cow basically drops dead, right? So this is why I would be reticent in suggesting that there is a kind of a harmonious relationship. But I do want to say that what you do have in India is you have a kind of a continuum, where you say that, well, what is really the line that you draw between animals and humans, right? I mean, is it such a firm line that we can draw between animals and humans? And perhaps we need animals in our midst, both to remind us of how we can become like animals at certain moments, and also to remind us what distinguishes us humans from animals, such as the faculty of reason and so on, right? So I'm suggesting something quite different. If you see that there is an intrinsic relationship, which I think Indian street culture actually bears out all the time, between animals and humans. And I think that that's one reason, by the way, that cows, you know, I don't know how many of you know this, but there has been a campaign going on for years in India with absolutely no success at all to remove cows from streets, because you're going down a major thoroughfare in the heart of the city, in the heart of the capital, and suddenly you're going to find 20 cows seated right there in the middle, and everybody is going to go around them. You know, they're like an island, right? Right? And you can't do anything about it. You cannot do anything about it at all. I mean, there are people who have tried to have these cows removed, and whenever, you know, the United States President or the UN Secretary General or the British Prime Minister is about to come to India, then suddenly they'll have a cow removing drive, so they'll remove all the cows, and then the minute the Prime Minister leaves, next day the cows are all back on the streets, right? Okay? And so, you know, this is, I'm suggesting to you, very interesting questions about how one thinks about a society. And in this case, what is a particular relationship between animals and humans, and why that's so important a part of what I've described as street culture. Okay? Now, before we get further into this question, what I want to do is I want to show you a segment of a film. Maybe somebody there could please switch off that light over there. And let's see if we can watch a little bit of this film. Okay? So this is a film called Sancha, which means the loom, okay? And what you have here is a small fragment. You're going to watch the first 10 minutes. This film is available to you now through that video furnace, you know. So it's a documentary that's about 50 minutes in length, and we're going to watch about 10 minutes of this film. Okay? He's singing in Marathi, language of Maharashtra, Western India. There was a little bit problem in how the film came out in this, so there'll be a few minutes where it stalls for a few seconds every now and then. Notice the importance of trains again, right? Immediately, because the minute you think of Mumbai, you think of VT, Victoria Terminus, and Churchgate. The trains coming in, carrying millions of people every day, right? These trains, by the way, don't have any doors. The doors have all been chopped off, so people hang outside. I mean, if you travel on one of these trains, you would know what I mean, Almost like Slumdog Millionaire scene, if you think about it, that towards the end, the railway terminus, yeah?
पटपूर खांद्यावर टाकून सह्याद्री घाट उतरून माझा बाप तुझ्या दारावर उभा राहिला श्रम घेऊन. केव्हा येई केव्हा निघून जाई ठाऊक जन्मदात्रीला एक आलेल्या म्हाताऱ्या घरात एका रात्री माझा जन्म. पगाराच्या दिवशी खिसातून आदळत दिसायचा तास आई भीतीने अंग चोरून उभी राहायची बिचारी कोपऱ्यात. आम्हावर भारी लोक एक दिवसही गेला नाही. आम्हावर भारी लोक एक दिवस.
Let me, by the way, just add a little comment here. When he's talking about, I mean, this is a typical story that you hear a lot from laboring people, working class people, like, for example, if you have maids and drivers and so on in your home, women who get beaten up by their husbands. And I don't, the one thing that you need to know is that in India, payday, which is either the 1st or the 7th of the month, depending on what part of India you're in, payday is a dry day. A dry day means that all liquor shops are shut that day. Okay? And the idea being that, this is a way to make sure that men who are getting paid that day are not squandering their entire paycheck on booze. Yeah? Right? So that day, payday, the 1st or the 7th of the month, is in every Indian city a dry day. Right? I mean, there is a state which is a dry state, and that is the state of Gujarat, although it's only technically dry because you can get plenty of alcohol if you know where to get it, but that's a different story, Sorry, this is it's just come out that way, Yeah.
का गेली तिचं तिला माहित. त्याच वाटेने इंडिया उत्पादन मिल मध्ये राशन डिपार्टमेंट म्हणजे काम करणारे गिरण कामगार गंगाराम कुशाची सुर्वे एके सकाळी 7च्या पाळीला माही मोरून चालत 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 महालक्ष्मीला यायचे. आणि त्यावेळेस त्यांच्या कानावर माझ्या रडण्याचा आवाज होता. त्याने मला घरी आणलं. घरी आई मला सांभाळणारी काशीबाई तिच्या स्वाधीन केलं म्हणाले हा आपला.
Everybody gets absorbed. Yeah?
ही सगळी हकीकत त्यांनी 10-12 वर्षाचा झालो असताना मला त्यांनी सांगितली की तू आम्हाला कसा सापडला, कुठे सापडला, तू कसा होतास. त्यांनी असं मला सांगितलं की तुझं पोट फार मोठं होतं, किरटा होत असेल. तेव्हा मराठीमध्ये एक म्हण आहे, हात पाय काड्या आणि पोट ढेर वाड्या, अशी मराठीमध्ये म्हण आहे. तर तसा तू होतास.
Sign of a child who is severely malnourished.
मला आपलं नाव दिलं.
Here's a street scene here, not more orderly, if I may put it this way. Red chilies.
आणि अंदाजे वय तेव्हा घ्यायचे शाळेत नुकत्याच म्युन्सिपल शाळा आल्या तेव्हा आईंच्या शाळेमध्ये माझं दाखल आणि ते अंदाजे वय लावलं तर ते माझं वय त्यांनी जी माझी जात लावली ती माझी जात त्यांनी जो माझा पत्ता दिला तो माझा पत्ता ते माझे मालकच होते मी एके ठिकाणी येऊन तरी बरं झालं वर्किंग क्लासची कामगाराची माझं रिलेशन असं म्हणतो.
Coriander is thrown in free when you buy vegetables from these vendors. That's the norm. Coriander and green chilies, you know. Yeah, so that's what is being thrown in there with the stack of vegetables. Do these buildings remind you of some city that anybody here has been to? And you know, sorry? European, yeah, but more specifically, where do you think they would have gotten the architecture from? Italy, no. I mean, India is a British colony, right? So London, right? London. In fact, actually, I mean, but you know, I'm asking this specifically for one reason. You know, what is the original and what is a copy is a much more complicated question in my view than we think it is. You know, so I, for example, saw London before I saw Bombay. I went to Bombay for the first time when I was 21, and I'd been to London when I was 16 years old. Okay, and so when I went to Bombay, my first reaction was, my God, this city is a copy of London, right? Right? But in fact, if I can put it this way, to many Indians, when they go to London, they think London is a copy of Bombay. Right? It's a copy of Bombay. I mean, because they've seen London already. And I'm not here talking about the imagination. I'm talking about the way in which the city is laid out, what they imagine to be a quintessentially kind of English architecture. Right? So if you go to Churchgate, if you go to Victoria Terminus, you know, these kinds of buildings in Bombay, you immediately think to yourself, yeah, you know, this city is the original, and London is the copy of this particular city, right? So, you know, how a culture looks at the question of what is the original and what is the copy, if I may put it this way, it's not a unilateral movement where, well, there's something called the original. You know, there's an original Picasso painting, and yes, there are reproductions of it, you know, poster prints of it. That might be a little bit more easier because there you're talking about mechanical reproduction, right? But when you're looking at two cities of this kind, you know, the question of what comes first and what comes later is, I'm suggesting to you, a little bit more complicated than simply a kind of a unilateral history here, right? Okay, so let's continue.
And that really started me off on...
This is something that, you know, these gargoyles is something you don't find in Indian architecture, you know, at all, right?
When I came to Bombay and started looking around, the kind of first fruitful image that I kind of started working on was the image of workers that I used to encounter in the train. As I was making drawings of these working class figures, I was projecting myself, my own anger and frustration, whatever. But this confrontation with another person who had a life that was different from mine, who belonged to a class that was different from mine, that I did not really know at first hand what this life was. I was looking at it, but and I was drawn to it, but that is not the life that I had led. For example, there's a painting of a screaming woman or of a worker, which essentially are still expressionist in that sense. You know, they're basically about the artist's emotions. It kind of you know, made me conscious that I must observe more objectively, and I must draw back the projections that I'm making onto that this set of paintings, which is which are kind of single working class figures in a specific environment. This is the first set of painting in which Bombay as a city makes its appearance in my work.
Famous song from a film going back to about 30, 40 years. He's talking about servants and masters.
मुंबई हे सात बेटांचं गाव होतं आणि इथे मुख्यतः राहणारे कोळी हे मुंबईचे मूळचे होते. पुढे इंग्रज राज्य आले तर ही सात बेटं एकत्र आली. त्याला त्यांनी त्यावेळेस एक मुंबई किंवा काय नाव दिलं आणि त्या बेटांनी एकत्र आल्यानंतर इथे हा कापड उद्योग का निघाला त्याची कारणं अशी आहे. इथून मोठा समुद्र किनारा आहे. समुद्र किनारा असल्यामुळे हवामान दमट आहे आणि दमट हवामान हे कापसाला फार उपयुक्त असतं. आणि मुंबईतनं पुन्हा रेल्वे मार्ग त्यांनी सुरू केला.
So you read about this in that article you have, Indian trains, right? A little bit. The beginning of the first railway lines in 1850s when India was still under the British.
कळू आले तेव्हापासून डबा घेऊन साच्यावर घडवतो लोहार हातोड्याला तसाच घडवला गेलो. शिकलो तार कसे लावावी बाबीण केव्हा करावी आल्या खात्यात. इथे ज्या सागर तिरी झुंजत त्यानेही देह ठेवला. त्याच्या साच्यावर दमे करी मुकादमाने मला नेला. पण पुढे गंमत अशी झाली की 10-12 वर्षाची चौथी पास झालो. तर त्यामुळे मला ते म्हणाले की तू आता 10-12 वर्षात झाला चौथी शिकला आता हे 10 रुपये घे आणि तुम्ही कोकणात चालला. आणि मी पुन्हा अनाथ झालो. म्हणून माझ्या पोएट्रीमध्ये ना घर होते ना गणगोत चालेल केवढी पायाखालची जमीन.
This is that same Marine Drive that you saw in Diwar, yeah, that when they come into the city, you know, yeah, the footpaths. Okay. Okay, so here's a question for you now, given what he said. There are about, I mean, their estimates vary, but in a city like Calcutta, which has a population of about 15 million people, there are about maybe 6 to 7 million people who live on the street. Live. I'm not talking about just working on the street. They live on the street. So are these people homeless? Is that the best word to describe them, you think?
Well, do they have a shelter?
Oh, most of them don't. No, no. If you go to any of these big cities, Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, any one of them, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock in the evening, okay, the pavements, the streets start to be taken over slowly, okay, by these people. That is at All right, during the day they've done their transactions, they've sold vegetables, or they've, polished shoes, or whatever it is that they're doing, right? And then when it comes to night, they bring out their charpoys. So these charpoys are these cots made of like jute, if I may put it this way. Now they might be made of other kinds of things because those are going out of fashion, right? But they'll bring out their cots, or they'll simply bring out a few bed sheets, put them on the pavement, and lie down there. And next morning, unless some policeman kicks them in the middle of the night and says, get up. But next morning, at the crack of dawn, these people are up, right? So the answer to your question is the vast majority of them do not have shelters. The vast majority of them, right? So how would you characterize them? I mean, would homeless be the best word to describe these people? That would be the question that I'm asking you. Or do you think there might be some difficulty in using the idea of the homeless? Nikhil?
Homeless in America at least means
Transient.
or moving.
Yeah.
In India, these people clearly have a settled sense of space.
Yeah.
So in that respect, I don't think you can call them homeless.
I think I would agree with you. Yes. Right? I mean, if you look at these people, okay, and here again, I think, it's a matter of how you really do the work of interpretation, because I think the instinct immediately is to say that, well, hey, these people don't have a home, and home here is in the literal sense now, that is that they don't have a shelter, right? But what we really mean is they don't have a house. They don't have shelter. But if you don't have shelter and you don't have a house, that does not mean that you don't have a home. I think we have to make that distinction. Because these are people who very clearly belong to a community. Right? So when at 9 o'clock they start laying out their sheets or their cots, charpoys as they're called, right? 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night, I mean, you'll see them having a meal, playing a game of Ludo. Ludo is a big favorite in India, right? Playing a game of Ludo, or something, or card game, or gossiping, or chatting, whatever it is that they do. Right? The homeless is a category of modern industrial civilization. Right? I mean, the homeless really start to emerge in history when modern industrial civilization really begins. Because when modern industrial civilization begins, what it means is that some people are going to be cast off. Right? Because the culture of materialism, the culture of greed, the culture of self-aggrandizement is going to become so dominant that there are people who are simply no longer going to be accommodated in the rubric of society. Right? And so you see homeless people. You go to downtown LA and you're there at 10 o'clock at night or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. There's somebody who's homeless, because the person who's homeless is somebody who, the question is not whether that person has a shelter or not. Because at night they might even be able to go to a shelter, that's been opened up, which opens up at night, right? And there's a movement in India to do that now, by the way. There's a movement to say that, schools, for example, state schools, why shouldn't these buildings be used for people to sleep at night, right? And so some people have answered that suggestion by saying that, well, this assumes that they're actually homeless. Okay, maybe they don't have a shelter, but it's not quite the same as being homeless. And of course, this question becomes critical when you have a cold climate. When you have a really cold climate, it can also become critical, by the way, in a very hot climate. Right? The problem is, in a very hot climate, if you actually put people inside a room at night, it's probably worse than being out in the open, right? Because being in a concrete structure without having any fans, or forget about air conditioners, but having no fans at all, having no electricity, could actually be much worse, than being out in the open, right? Okay, so it's really the cold in a very cold climate, and in a place like Delhi, for example, the temperature will drop to about maybe, something like 5 degrees Celsius. So let's say 40 degrees, 40, something like that. 38, 39, 40. So it's not the kind of temperature where you would obviously freeze to death, really, although it's pretty cold. But it cannot be decided on this technical question, right? Because the real question here has to do with, what do we understand when we say that a person is homeless, Right? And one of the things that's happened in the US, for example, at different points in the last 20, 25 years, depending on how much funds are being allocated by the state for these kinds of things. But when you close down psychiatric hospitals, for example, right? You close down a hospital and you say that, well, all of these people have to be shoved out of here, and if nobody is willing to take them, if their family members are not willing to take them, these people become homeless. Right? Right? And so I'm suggesting to you that we're going to have to be very careful when we immediately make the inference that the 5 million people who sleep out on the street, and I was prompted to say this at this point in time because he's talking about how when he was 10 or 12 years old, he's abandoned once again. Okay, so he's abandoned, but then we're going to have to follow the life history of these people and say, well, by virtue of the fact that he's abandoned, does this mean that he has actually become a homeless person? And I'm suggesting to you that in the vast majority of the cases in India, that is not what has happened, because the person still belongs to some kind of human community, belongs to a community, shares his stories, shares his food, shares his life, his or her life, with somebody else, and becomes part of that human community. Right? And it seems to me that in that sense, the condition of the homeless in America, or indeed, and that is happening in some Indian cities now, right, is quite different. Right? And it's not really happened to a great degree, but slowly you're beginning to see, if I may put it this way, the emergence of a modern kind of homeless person in India as well, although for the most part that's not the case. Yeah.
So if there's settled spaces,
yeah. Yeah.
people easily get taken in within that street culture?
Yeah. Let's supposing that a 80-year-old or 10-year-old boy runs away from home, okay, and comes to the city, comes to that particular neighborhood. The question is whether he would be absorbed into that particular community. That's what you're really asking. Most likely he would be. It could be that community, or it could be some other community, right? It could be, because if I may put it this way, these communities are in a way miniature neighborhoods. I mean, they're miniature neighborhoods, Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it's so much the lack of belonging to a community as the fact that they belong to communities that don't have any rights. Like, if somebody wants that community removed, they can do so because the people don't have the force. And the communities are, not legal, so
Yes.
they aren't necessarily obligated to receive the same services as communities that are homes,
Yeah, that are legal or that have residential permits and that kind of thing. Yeah.
more vulnerability to becoming homeless.
Oh, absolutely.
Out of your community and not so much a
Yeah.
state of homelessness.
Absolutely. You're absolutely on the mark. I mean, if, because making an argument of this kind does not suggest by any stretch of the imagination that they may not be vulnerable, right? And they may not be vulnerable, which is why when I was talking about the vendors, you remember that one of the things I pointed out was that don't forget that there is a state there, right? So that one cannot think of the Indian street simply as some kind of organic community there, because at a moment's notice, the state can come down and encroach upon you. In fact, I'm using the word encroach deliberately because that's what these people are called. They're described as people who have encroached upon, a standard neighborhood or a and of course there's friction between these people and the neighborhoods in the midst of which you're going to find these communities. Constant friction. So the question of vulnerability is very much there, although I think that we would have to add that, just by sheer virtue of the fact that you live in a neighborhood and are living in a proper residence and so forth doesn't mean that your vulnerability levels necessarily go down. We would have to look at the particular kind of neighborhoods, but in general the proposition you're making is absolutely correct, namely that the better off you are, the more entitlements you have, the less vulnerable you are, so forth and so on. No question about it. Yeah. Nishita, I think you had your hand up as well.
Oh, I was just going to actually talk about the same thing, but then
Yeah.
when you were talking, it brought up the question of like homeless within the Indian context. Is that also provided with the fact that they are providing services and actually kind of have a job and are actually making some income even though they live out on the street?
Well, that would vary from if I may put it this way, person to person, because some of these people are going to be beggars. The number of beggars in India has come down substantially, but you will certainly find them in metropolitan areas. You're going to find whole communities or colonies of beggars almost. and there's a whole question of how, in fact, the trade, if I may put it this way, of begging might itself be organized in certain ways. So you could say that, well, that's a job too, by the way. I mean, it's possible to make that argument if you wanted to. I mean, certainly if you remember Slumdog, this particular question comes up in that film. But the answer to your question, really, strictly speaking, is that not all of these people are gainfully employed. I mean, some of them are just going to be loafing around, particularly the children. Right? I mean, so it's not a question that they're necessarily providing services. I mean, you would really have to really look at, if I may put it this way, you know, from person to person, because you're going to find people who, as I said, live in the street, but then the same people during the day, the very same spot where they sleep is a spot where they're going to set up their cooking utensils and dish out food. So yes, they're gainfully employed, but there are others who are not gainfully employed in that sense, you know. Well, no. I mean, there's no real category for. I mean, if you had to translate the word homeless into Hindi, it would be hard to do that because there is no category in that language for people who are homeless. Yeah. Right. Okay. Well, we're going to stop over here. There's some of you who have not, even down to this day, not picked up your papers. So if you're here and you haven't picked up